Hello, and welcome to our lecture for Chapter 2, Drug Use as a Social Problem, for our online section of PBH435. When we talk about the problems that are related to consuming drugs, we can break those into two really broad categories. The first one is problems that are related to taking the drug. These are physical problems that result from consuming the substance. So it may be the risk of developing dependence, or it could be risks that come with taking too much of a particular substance. The health risks of consuming cocaine, or the risk of alcohol suppressing respiration to the point where a person stops breathing. Now, there's another major category of problems related to drug use that are related to the fact that we consider it a deviant behavior. Here we're talking about legal consequences such as getting arrested or fined, and then also the expenses that go with trying to prevent drug use and treat drug use here in our society. So we've got these two really broad categories. Now, when we look at the way that we handle drugs legally here in the United States, we see a really broad and widely scoped change that occurred in the 1800s. So before this change occurred, the United States had a very laissez-faire approach to drug use and drug restriction. Laissez-faire basically kind of means hands-off, let it be. So drugs were produced, manufactured, consumed, all without legal consequences or legal standards for those processes. The photo here for cocaine tooth drops. If you can imagine seeing that in Rite Aid or CVS these days, you can see that's it's a great example of how those rules and regulations have changed here in the U.S. So before these laws started to change, you could produce a drug in your backyard. You could make cocaine tooth drops, you could make heroin nerve tonic, and if you put it in a bottle and put a label on it and sold it, there's nothing illegal or against the law about what you were doing. Even if you made claims about your cocaine tooth drops or your heroin nerve tonic that were untrue, these were not against the law. Now, if your medication was toxic, then people probably would stop buying it. And if your medication didn't do what you said it was going to do, there's a chance they might stop buying it as well. But there really were no legal standards or legal restrictions on you coming up with something like that. Or selling something that we now consider a controlled substance. So when we think about why those rules started to change to our current environment with all of the legal requirements and restrictions around those processes, they kind of focus around these three main concerns: toxicity, dependence, and crime. So drugs were likely to become regulated if they were dangerous. They were likely to become regulated if they led to dependence among regular users, and they were also likely to become regulated if people perceived a risk of crime among the people who use them. So in all these broad categories, we can see drugs that used to be unregulated becoming regulated in the U.S. during that time period. Now, when we talk about toxic drugs, drug-related toxicity, we're going to start by defining toxic. It's something that we use pretty loosely in our society, whether it's for song lyrics, or we're going to do some kind of cleanse to clear toxins out of our body. But the definition here is a toxic substance is one that's poisonous, deadly, or dangerous, and that's the way we'll use it here in class. So when we talk about toxicity, we can break these into broad categories. We've got physiological versus behavioral toxicity. These are things, dangerous behaviors that occur in the behavior category related to taking the drug, or the actual physical effects of the drug on the body in the physiological category. And then we've also got acute versus chronic toxicity. Substances can cause different effects in your body and in your life if you consume them at the time that you're consuming them, which is the acute toxicity, versus the results of consuming them over the long term, which is that chronic toxicity. Now, when we talk about physiological toxicity, we're talking about the immediate changes in the body, and these can be acute or chronic. So an acutely toxic effect of consuming prescription painkillers could be that they suppress respiration to the point where the user stops breathing. Now, chronic physiological toxicity, this is long-term exposure to the drug, long-term introduction of the substance into the body. And here in the image we have the effects of chronic exposure to alcohol in a liver. This is cirrhosis, chronic physiological toxicity from consuming alcohol. These might include other effects like high blood pressure, heart disease, lung cancer from smoking cigarettes. So these physiological toxicities can be either acute or chronic, but they are directly related to the physical consumption of the substance. Now, when we talk about behavioral toxicity, these consequences can also be acute or chronic. If we think about the example of alcohol consumption, one acute behavioral toxicity from alcohol consumption might be a DUI or a car accident caused from driving under the influence. So this dangerously impairs your behavioral functioning, but it's happening in the moment. It has to do with you consuming the alcohol at that particular moment in time. Now, chronic behavioral toxicity, these are the effects of continuing to consume that substance over a long period of time. It might affect your ability to stay employed, it might affect your interpersonal relationships. You can see lots of ways where the chronic consumption of a substance, of a dangerous drug, could result in that behavioral toxicity. So again, we have that breakdown between the immediate effects of consuming the substance versus the long-term effects of consuming that substance over time. Now, we talked about a couple of other data sources in our previous lecture. Today we're going to talk about the Drug Abuse Warning Network, or DAWN. This is a source of data that we use for information about acute toxicity of drug consumption. Basically, emergency rooms in hospitals in cities around the United States, not all hospitals, but a sample of hospitals, collect data on drug-related ER visits. What DAWN collects is information on illicit drugs like heroin and cocaine, but also misuse of legal prescription and over-the-counter drugs. Now, what it doesn't determine is whether or not the drugs caused the ER visit. So if you're driving your car and you have a car crash for another reason, but you get to the emergency room and your blood test indicates that you were consuming cocaine, your data gets reported. Now, we're not trying to determine whether the cocaine caused your car crash or not, just that you came into the emergency room and that you had that positive blood test for cocaine use. So when we look at what we find out from DAWN, we find out that our single biggest reason for emergency room visits related to substance consumption is alcohol in combination with another drug. Now, we are looking only at illicit drug use. And the fact is that if we looked at alcohol-related visits only, all of these other statistics would be dwarfed in comparison. But because we're looking at illicit drug use, alcohol is still our number one, but it's illicit, so we're looking at alcohol in combination with other drugs. And then we move through some of the other ones that you might expect: cocaine, prescription opioids. These are our prescription painkillers that we just discussed. Marijuana, heroin, they all make our top 10 list here. But again, if we think about the impact of alcohol, legal consumption of alcohol, again, these all look like a rounding error if we compare it to that. So, DAWN doesn't really tell us how dangerous a drug is. We're really just reporting the number of mentions in total ER visits. It doesn't tell us how dangerous the drug is in comparison to the number of people who are using it. And again, it doesn't really tell us the cause of why the person was there. If you consume marijuana the night before and you're on a ladder hanging Christmas lights, you fall off the ladder, you go to the emergency room, you test positive for marijuana, then that is going to be listed as that will be reported through DAWN as an ER visit related to illicit substance consumption. So you can see how this, again, as a source of data, isn't perfect, although it's another way that we try to approach this problem, another way to try and report data on this behavior of drug consumption here in the United States. Now, when we start talking about specific toxicities, one of the ones that we'll be worried about for users who inject drugs is going to be bloodborne pathogens. So this is a toxicity that's not related to the drug itself. If you are an injection drug user, and if you share needles and you use a dirty needle, the bloodborne pathogens that you might be exposed to are not directly related to the drug that you might be injecting, but it is related to the equipment. So we share needles and then we pass infectious agents directly into the bloodstream. And these are things, of course, like HIV, hepatitis B and C, some really nasty bloodborne pathogens that can be passed this way. So in some communities, we use this technique called syringe exchange. You may have heard of it as needle exchange. And this is an example of a public health approach called harm reduction. Now, ideally, we would of course want to see the person using injectable drugs to stop using drugs altogether. But that is a complicated problem that we'll continue to talk about throughout the semester. Immediately, we know that if the person is sharing dirty needles, that they are exposing themselves to this health risk of bloodborne pathogens. So some communities choose to have folks who are injecting to come in and swap out those dirty needles for clean ones. Obviously, there are some people who have some other opinions about whether this is a good idea, but we do know that if local governments provide this option, that we lower the rate of infection in those communities of injectable drug users. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in class. So, we talked a bit about last class about how not all drug consumption is considered a problem. But obviously here in class we're going to be focusing more on that, on problematic drug use. And again, we're not really going to use that term addiction because we have a very hard time defining it, and we're looking for a precisely defined term here in our class. So when we try to talk about whether someone is addicted to or dependent on a drug, we've got some important questions. The first one is it a problem? And we define that by what drug they're taking, how much time it takes out of their life to be spent on that drug taking, and then how much of the drug are they actually using. And what we're looking for, of course, is that point where drug use goes from recreational to problematic. Marijuana is a really interesting substance to be talking about in this case because we've seen such a dramatic change in popular opinion about consumption of marijuana. And it's possible that here in our community you know someone who you consider or considers themselves a recreational marijuana user. It may be that you don't really see their use as recreational, that you see it as problematic. We see this a lot with alcohol consumption as well. Because it is a legal drug, people tend to be much more upfront and straightforward about their use. And you may have that in your in your network of friends as well, someone who considers their use of alcohol recreational where you see it as problematic. Throughout the class, if any of the situations or scenarios that we discuss seem to refer to someone you love, maybe perhaps to yourself, we do have some excellent resources here on campus for you to go to when we talk about substance dependence issues. And I'll be posting to Web Campus information on Hyper. This is our support system here on campus. A group of undergraduates, graduate students who come together to talk about recovery issues. And it stands for Helping Young People Experience Recovery. So along the way, if you have any questions about dependence issues, please feel free to email me through the course, ask about a problem with a friend, or to reach out to some of our other on-campus resources, which I'll be posting to Web Campus for your information. Now, when we talk about what makes a person dependent on a substance, we have some basic processes that we're looking for. These are things that occur with repeated drug use. The first one is tolerance, and then we're looking at physical dependence and psychological dependence. Now, all of these can be defined and studied much more carefully than a broad term like addiction, and they are all able to be measured in a more precise way. When we talk about tolerance, this may be a term that you're familiar with in terms of alcohol consumption. And what we're talking about is the fact that novice users may experience different effects or some more strong effects than individuals who've been consuming the drug for a longer period of time. And what that means is if you're consuming the drug because you like the after effects, then as you develop tolerance as an experienced user, you may need to consume more of that drug to experience the effects that are appealing to you. Basically, the body likes to maintain itself in a relatively steady fashion that we call homeostasis. So your body, if you're going to continue to expose it to the substance, is going to find ways to compensate for the chemical imbalances that the drug causes. Now our second category, was physical dependence. Now physical dependence has a very straightforward definition, and that is the occurrence of a withdrawal symptom if drug use is suddenly stopped. Typically, we're going to see tolerance come first and then physical dependence come after. And then physical dependence means that your body has adapted to that presence of the drug as a regular feature of your life. And when you stop consuming the drug, that you start to see those after effects, that withdrawal syndrome, because you have stopped consuming. And then finally, our third category, psychological dependence. Now, what we're talking here is not about those physical changes in your body, but about the changes in your thought processes that make the drug use a regular part of your life. What we often see here in this category of psychological dependence is high frequency of drug use. We see cravings, and then we see that tendency to relapse even after even if a person is able to stop the first time. Now, what we tend to see here, we tend to see the description of psychological dependence, meaning that the drug taking is reinforced by consequences. So if you are taking the drug to alter your reality because you find your current reality negative or depressing, and the drug makes you feel better, then you see the drug reinforcing your psychological desires. So the drug taking is reinforced by the consequences. And we see evidence when we look at dangerous drugs and laboratory animals, that animals will engage in the same behavior. If they're exposed to a drug of abuse, they will engage in the same behaviors as humans, even when that behavior is self-destructive. Now, we talked about how the legal environment for drug consumption here in the United States has changed, and along the way we've also seen changing views of dependence and what that means here in the U.S. Now, before about 1960, we wouldn't characterize somebody as addicted, and that broader term was more common use at that time. We wouldn't characterize somebody as truly addicted to a drug unless they had that physical dependence that we talked about. And so we assume that if we could treat those withdrawal symptoms, if somebody stops drinking alcohol and starts experiencing the DTs, then if we could treat the DTs, if we could treat the tremors or those withdrawal symptoms, then we'd be able to help that person break their addiction and stop consuming the drug. But we found that people who had no clear withdrawal symptoms, people who were regularly taking, say, cocaine, and didn't experience withdrawal symptoms from stopping taking the drug, did continue that dependence, despite the fact that there were none of those withdrawal symptoms, which we expected to characterize addiction. So starting in the 1960s, we started to look at this a different way. We started to look at dependence as related to a positive reinforcement model. And we found that drugs can reinforce behavior without actually causing that physical dependence. And that reinforcement is increasingly now viewed as the driving force behind repeated drug use, which makes it a psychological issue, which makes it more complicated to treat. Now, when we look at the clinical definitions of substance use disorders, we're going to be looking at DSM-5. So this is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition, and that's abbreviated as DSM-5. This is the defining document of the American Psychiatric Association, and it provides the diagnostic criteria and definitions for many psychiatric disorders, well beyond the scope of the substance-related issues we'll be talking about here in class. And it has very complex definitions, which is typical when we talk about psychiatric disorders. Now, when we're looking at substance use disorders, as discussed in the DSM-5, here's the formal definition that they'll use. A problematic pattern of substance use leading to clinically significant impairment or distress as manifested by at least 2 of 11 possible symptoms occurring within a 12-month period. So, this is not a simple, straightforward diagnosis. It's quite complex. And those 11 possible symptoms, 9 of them are behavioral, 2 of them are physiological. So even within those symptoms, we have multiple categories. And those physiological symptoms, that changing model of drug dependence, those do not have to be present for a person to receive the diagnosis of a substance dependence. Now, we also rank those by severity. A person could have a mild substance use disorder or a severe substance use disorder, depending on how many symptoms the treatment professional notes in their behavior. So, interesting question here about whether dependence is caused by the substance itself. And an interesting fact to note is that some drugs are indeed more likely to lead to dependence. And when we talk about inhaled substances, nicotine versus marijuana are an interesting example of this. So if we look at the chart here on the right, and we look at the number of people who are able to who are likely to continue to become dependent after a year of nicotine use, and after a year of marijuana use, we see that they remain about the same. But as we look at that, smoking that substance becoming a chronic behavior, we find that after 10 years of use, the folks who are continuing to smoke nicotine products are their likelihood of becoming dependent is 15.6, and that for marijuana it's down to 5.9. So we see some real differences over the long term. And then if we look at the lifetime estimate, much higher for nicotine than for marijuana. So there's something specific to the drugs themselves, nicotine and marijuana being an interesting comparison there because they are both smoked. So there's some characteristics about the drug themselves, but then there's lots of other non-drug factors that can influence your risk of dependence. We talked about that desire to alter reality, and that doesn't really affect whether you're smoking nicotine or marijuana. You still have that basic desire to make your life different than it is, or to make it feel different than it is, that may lead you to consume substances, such as either one of those. A question that we've been dealing with in the field for the past several decades is whether the dependence is biological. We talked about that change in the 1960s, and we're trying to figure out whether that's due to specific biochemical or physiological actions in the brain that we can observe and point to. We don't really have clear answers for that, but we have investigated several different categories. And the first one, genetic, is one that we talk about a lot. We've invested genetic markers, physiological markers, and biochemical markers that we can use to test someone and say, is that person dependent or are they not dependent? So we do see physiological consequences from drug taking, and we do see a role for genetics, but we don't have a specific test that we can point to that looks for specific factors that we can say will lead to or prevent dependence on a substance or a group of substances. Another question that we encounter a lot is whether there is an addictive personality. This is one that we see discussed quite a bit in popular culture. But because of the nature of scientific experiments, it's really not a question that we can answer. So to be able to truly answer a question like this, we would have to set up an experiment. We'd have to take a group of people and expose them regularly to a drug of dependence, like heroin, and then we'd have to take another group of people that were not exposed to that drug of dependence, and then we'd have to see whether their personalities were different at the end. Now, obviously, there are some very severe moral and ethical concerns about setting up an experiment like that, and it's really not something that we're ever going to be able to do in public health. So what we do is we let people make their own choices, and then we observe them afterwards to see their effects. So if we take a group of people and we survey them when they graduate from high school, and then we survey them again 10 years later, and we look for people who have become regular heroin users, we can expect to find some things at the end of that 10 years that are different about the regular heroin users, but we're not going to be able to say whether the heroin caused that or whether those factors were present before. One personality factor that we do know that we do point to as an indicator of drug dependence is this characteristic of sensation seeking. And what we're able to associate this with is particularly with early substance use and abuse. So it's not necessarily an indicator of later in life substance use and abuse, but we know that early reporting of these behaviors is associated with that sensation seeking personality. So this question of genetics, whether dependence is a family disorder, is also something that we see a lot of discussion of in popular culture. And it's difficult to separate from a dysfunctional family framework. We know particularly with alcohol, probably because of its legal status, that we often see alcohol abuse and alcohol-related disorders, alcohol dependence-related disorders in the same co-occur with other kinds of family dysfunction. And because, again, of that basic desire to consume substances to alter reality, it's possible that dysfunctional relationships may play a role in dependence, but it's not the only factor. So you may know of people who come from that because of the high prevalence of alcohol-related use and abuse problems in the United States. You may know someone who comes from a family with strong family patterns towards alcohol consumption and has made very different choices, perhaps not to consume alcohol at all. Or maybe they've come out of that background and they do have a very healthy relationship with alcohol where they're able to consume when they want and stop when they want, and they've been able to move beyond that family dysfunctional background. So we know that there are lots of factors that contribute to this, but we do see a role for that dysfunctional family, those dysfunctional family relationships. But it's hard to separate what's due to genetics and then what's due to that family, that nature versus nurture debate. So we have another question that comes up quite a bit when we talk about especially the negative consequences of substance dependence, and that is whether or not dependence on a substance is a disease. One of the first groups to characterize dependence this way were the folks who founded AA, or Alcoholics Anonymous. But there are others who say that dependence isn't really a disease as we understand that in other contexts. There are no tests that a person can be given to see what the underlying cause would be. So there are folks who suggest that this might be better as an analogy than a specific category. So one of the things that we'll talk a lot about here in class is this biopsychosocial perspective, where when we look at substance dependence, it is a complex disorder, and it's related to dysfunctions of biology, personality, and social interactions. So we don't necessarily characterize other diseases in this way, and substance use and abuse may be unique in this fashion. So that we'll come back a lot to that biopsychosocial perspective of substance dependence. Now, here's an interesting one, another question that we see quite a bit. Does drug use cause crime? If we're looking at drugs as a social problem, then the crime that may or may not be related to drug use would be an important part of it. So this breaks down into a couple of different issues. The first one is that drug use may change a person's personality. Now again, we don't really have a lot of evidence to support this because of the immoral or unethical nature of experiments that we could use to prove it. But we do see, when we talked about in our other lecture, things like aggressive behavior, identification with deviant peer groups, we do see some indicators that criminal or antisocial behavior may precede drug use. So there may be some indicators about personality, but we're not able to identify them in any kind of any consistent predictive manner. And then there's a separate issue, which is that people under the influence of drugs may commit crimes. Now, we don't have much evidence that illicit drugs cause criminal behavior. So we're looking at that specific causal relationship. There may be correlations there, but we don't have evidence that illicit drugs actually cause that criminal behavior. But we do have a lot of studies that link alcohol consumption, so again, alcohol as our legal drug, to violent crime. Data tells us that over half of murder victims and over half of people who commit murder are consuming alcohol at the time of the crime. So we really have those separate categories, that drugs may change a person's personality and encourage that criminal behavior from that direction, or that people under the influence, because of the effects of the drug, things like interfering with judgment and good decision making, may commit crimes while under that influence. And then another issue, drugs can become expensive. Somebody who has a regular pattern of drug consumption has to find a way to fund it. So they may be, those crimes may be related to trying to get money or acquire the drug in other ways. And then finally, our fourth issue, in many cases, consuming the drug is a crime in and of itself. So separate from all of those other kinds of possible criminal behaviors, just strictly consuming the drug, like consuming marijuana for recreational reasons here in Nevada, is a crime in and of itself. So we can see how those that potential relationship between drug consumption and crime can get complicated to define. So we're talking today about drug use as a social problem, and we started by talking about the legal environment for drug use here in the United States. We went through that transition in the 1800s where we went from that laissez-faire attitude to an attempt to regulate drug use. So we do have some things that we need to recognize. The first is that those laws to regulate drug use may have a legitimate social purpose. We'd like to think that when the drugs were developed, they were developed as part of this master plan to protect society from some of the dangers such as criminal behavior that we discussed in the previous slides. However, if we look back at the way that the legal environment for drug use here in the United States developed, we really don't see that rational approach. we tend to see a much more reactive approach, and we'll continue to talk about that here in class. So what we've ended up with is a patchwork system of drug laws that may not be realistic or effective when we look at patterns of drug use and abuse in our society. So wrapping up today, our lecture on Chapter 2, we've talked first about physiological versus behavioral toxicity, so the dangerous effects of taking a drug that are related to the actual changes in the body, such as suppressing respiration, or behavioral choices, such as being in a car accident while driving under the influence of alcohol. We talked about DAWN, or the Drug Abuse Warning Network, and how it reflects mostly our views on deviant drug use. So drugs that are more socially acceptable, such as alcohol or nicotine, don't get reported through the system. It is one of our best sources of data on those illicit drugs, and another one that we'll refer back to over the semester. So we talked about physical versus psychological dependence. When we try to define dependence, physical dependence is fairly easy. We're looking at the presence of a withdrawal syndrome when a person stops consuming the substance, versus psychological dependence, the mental need to continue taking the drug, which can be more complicated to define. We looked at our formal definitions of abuse and dependence through the DSM-5. As you move through your week, please don't forget to complete the study guide that goes along with this lecture. Again, those are not collected or submitted or graded, but they're excellent preparation for your exams. You also have your assignments from LearnSmart that are due, and then of course your discussion question. Your main response to the discussion question should be posted by Wednesday of this week, and then replies to at least 2 other classmates by midnight on Saturday. Thank you, and I'll look forward to our next lecture.